Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share my first look at the Sony G-Series 20 to 70 millimeter f4 lens. Now this retails for roughly $1,100 US. I'll include a link in the description. And of course, as always, in full disclosure, this was furnished to me by Sony for review purposes. It will be going back after a couple of weeks. So this is a lens that I have been waiting for a really long time. And I don't just mean from Sony, granted, because this lens has been out for roughly half a year, but I mean in general terms. And that's because before this lens at $1,100, your option pretty much since Sony entered the mirrorless space was this one right here, the 24 to 70 millimeter f4 Zeiss lens, which has been a stalwart of the lineup. And this used to be basically the best option once upon a time that you could get, that money actually could buy before, G Master was a thing. And over time, of course, it became a value lens. And Sony no longer uses Carl Zeiss, and apparently Zeiss now has exited the DI business. But all of that aside, this is still an excellent lens even here in 2023. And it retails now, I think last I checked, for around $700 US, brand new. And if value is what you're after, the Sony or Sony Zeiss f4 24 to 70 might still be the right lens for you. But if you can stomach the 1100, or I should say 1099 US retail sticker on this lens, at least from what we know about it, it should be much, much better. Now, in terms of optics, I expect a sharp lens, but when it comes to the features that this has to offer, that's the huge difference that if we were going to do a comparison, which clearly I can't do yet, but that will be coming to that older lens. And that's because this has all of the properties, not just design language, of Sony's current modern, I will call them, lenses for full frame application. And by the way, if you're shooting with APS-C, this is going to be a great option as well. In fact, this is pretty much, I feel, going to be, if it already was, but at least it's finally in the studio now here. But in my opinion, if this works out as expected, this will be basically the best kit lens option that money can buy in the Sony ecosystem. And I say that because it at least appears to be, from what I've seen, sharp through its entire range. Again, 20 to 70, which is wider than that 24 mil that I just shared with all of you. F4 certainly is enough for the majority of use case scenarios. And if you know you need something faster, well, you're going to get something faster. Sony sent over an A7 IV for me to test this with. I'll also throw it on my A1. The only other full-frame Sony cameras that I have anymore, obviously the FX3 I'm filming on now, which maybe I'll test it with. After all, this is more video-centric than any kit lens that Sony has really ever made at this price point. And then, besides that, I have my old A7R Mark II, which is still a great camera, but not necessarily a great reference point for sharing performance in reviews, because most of you are on bigger and better things, and by that I just mean really newer, don't I? So what is nice about this is that we, of course, have faster autofocus, modern autofocus in Sony's mirrorless world here in this lens. We also have an iris lock, as you can see right there, which is certainly nice to have. We also have, of course, control of our aperture here, and you can turn that clicking on and off, a feature that I personally love, because while it is good to know where you are in your range by way of feel, muscle memory, if you will, it's definitely nice to be able to turn off that clicking sound when you don't need it, aka video. You do not want that. So ever since Sony introduced that, I've always thought it should be standard, and slowly but surely it pretty much has become standard. And then we have, of course, our autofocus switch right there. I should just call it our focus switch. And then we have our customizable buttons as well. You can hold focus, assign those. So really a lot of controls on this that just, again, if we go back in time to this guy, they just didn't exist. But that's not it. Then we get into something like focus breathing, and the focus breathing compensation is functional here with this lens, something that, again, you can't do with that older 24 to 70. So basically modern Sony cameras, this is a lens built for them, which is a really good thing. So if you're shooting on something like an A7R V, or of course any of the other latest and greatest models, you're probably going to be enamored with the performance of this piece of glass. Again, if this is the price point, focal range, and f4 is okay with you for the majority of what you shoot. 72 mil thread there for any sort of filters that you want to attach. And again, construction on this is really nice. I mean, ever since Sony made this their standard design language across their lenses, which I feel like the old 24 to 105 was one of the first that carried this design language. Of course, along with G Masters, but I mean in the G series of lenses. From there, we've just seen it, spread throughout their entire line, and it's a good thing. It's functional. The zoom and focus rings pretty much have I would say, the performance and the finesse that you'd want. On this, I will say that this focus ring is really loose, and that's probably going to be one of the biggest differences in terms of physical feel versus the old Zeiss. Yeah, I've got a smoother rotation on the old Zeiss, but the old Zeiss is all metal, and this, of course, is a combination of polycarbonates. It's not I don't think it's a totally plastic lens like the 16 to 35 power zoom f4 that I'm filming on right now. But again, same design language there as well. All the same features, nuance. It's just, I think it's a smart thing, this uniformity in design language. Just to show all of you what it's going to look like on a body, let's go ahead and throw it onto the A7 IV. And, when Sony asked me which body I would want, the A7 IV, until it is supplanted, I still feel like is going to be one of the most popular cameras in the lineup, because after all, its price point, its feature set, when we see the A7 V, well, it will be replaced. Until then, this is still, just one of those cameras. And granted, we just saw the launch of the A6700. Hopefully I'll get that sooner than later to share with all of you. That is a really exciting camera for me as someone who now I'm being pushed farther away from being able to shoot with bodies that, carry this sort of heft, or my A1, just because of what I've got going on with my neck and my back. And for years I've talked about that, bigger isn't necessarily better. Sony's focus used to be on small DI cameras that had phenomenal performance, and we slowly evolved into this larger format. And it's not a bad thing, but I'm glad Sony hasn't forgotten the lighter weight bodies for use case scenarios like mine, where, even though I love my A1, I can't use it like I, used to, or any of my larger full frame bodies. So getting some options, the Sony ZV-E1, I'm digressing here, but the ZV-E1 sort of represents what I'm talking about, but also doesn't, because it's a video camera first. And that's where I'll come into this lens again, is that this lens, unlike the Sony that I brought into frame at the beginning, is video optimized. And that's something that, if like me, you're someone who is a hybrid shooter, you will appreciate, because historically that just was not the case. I mean, you have to remember, when a lens like this was launched, it doesn't mean it was bad for video. It's not. It is still a really good lens for video as well. But back then, when this was launched, video was in its infancy on Sony's mirrorless cameras. We were not shooting 4K. We were shooting 1080p, and it was going to be a while before we saw 4K, which meant that back then, all of these cameras that Sony launched were still cameras first. Even the original A7S, as much as people like to pretend or don't know any better, and they think that that was a video camera at its inception, no, it was a camera that was a still camera meant to be able to shoot in low light conditions, unlike anything before. And it evolved over time. But again, you have to remember, all of these Sony cameras were still cameras first. Now, of course, we live in a fully hybrid world where the best hybrid camera usually wins the accolades, and that's what the A1 is, in my opinion. It's the best of both worlds. It doesn't mean that it will outperform every other camera in each specific category, but it is going to outperform any camera that tries to take it on that is a hybrid. And a lens like this is actually going to work well on that. That's the beauty of this new 20 to 70. It's not so new anymore, but it's new to me, is that, historically, when we looked at different lenses, we would say, oh, it's not optimized for the new sensors. It cannot resolve the resolution. Well, this guy can. And having an affordable piece of glass that's optimized for video and still has fast autofocus, again, I'm, presupposing this along with having 6 months of reviews under the belt already, right, like most of you, then this is a little bit of magic here because it's not going to suffer on any camera. If it can perform well in the A1, A7 IV, and even my FX3, which it seems like on paper it will, then this is an incredibly versatile lens at an affordable price that's going to deliver solid results. And the fact that it got wider, I mean, that's another thing I love personally. I love to shoot wide, ultra wide. So to me, getting wider than 24 is a godsend. I mean, I've moved almost exclusively to ultra wide. Even the 16 to 35 I'm filming on now would probably be my go-to lens. But with something like this, that could knock it off the block. Unfortunately, it doesn't have power zoom, which I do still like to use. I like that versatility. But that's a conversation for another time. But that pretty much rounds things out, at least for this first look. Again, I don't have a tremendous amount of time with it as I struggle to get the lens hood on, but I have enough time that you're going to know my impressions. I'm going to be able to tell all of you whether or not I think it's worth that $1,100 price point, and certainly whether or not you do yourself any sort of disservice saving the money and getting the older Zeiss 24 to 70, since I imagine they are going to be very, very comparable, but again, more modern, different build quality standards, I think more ergonomic, with having the rubber rings as opposed to the metal ones. That's really a matter of personal taste, personal preference. But let me know what all of you think. I'm curious to know. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. And as usual, please feel free to subscribe and please stay safe. Later.